Putin says he has all these red lines, but in reality, they're threats that are never going to materialise. And I think for Biden, he's only got a few more weeks left as president. He is very, very concerned about what his legacy is going to look like. And when it comes to the use of long-range weapons inside Russia, I think he's thinking, well, I don't want to escalate things just before I leave office to the point that then we end up in some war between the West and Russia. And he's just very nervous about doing anything dramatic before then, I think. So I think a decision on it will probably come when we see another president in the White House.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hanson, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by Larisa Brown, the Times' defence editor. Larisa, always a pleasure. Welcome to Frontline.
Thank you.
Let's begin by talking about President Zelensky's speech to the UN General Assembly. Obviously, he's there to speak to world leaders and encourage them to support his victory plan for the war in Ukraine. How do you think his speech will have gone down?
Well, I don't think there were any big surprises. Obviously, we're having him present this victory plan today to Joe Biden, so the exact detail we haven't seen. Obviously, Zelensky wants Ukraine to join NATO. He wants a proper pathway for that. And he also wants Ukraine to be allowed to use those long-range weapons inside Russia. There's no surprises that then we heard from Putin last night. He was talking about nuclear weapons and changing the nuclear rules. And so I think a lot is hanging on this meeting today and what Joe Biden is going to decide. Is he going to support Zelensky's victory plan or is he not? And I think Zelensky is probably going to go away a little bit disappointed.
We'll come back to that meeting in a moment. Just bring us up to speed with what exactly Vladimir Putin has been saying.
So Putin has been talking about the nuclear doctrine, and every few weeks he says something about Russia's nuclear doctrine. And the idea is probably that he's trying to frighten Western allies into supporting Ukraine in the way it wants. And so in the last few hours, we've heard from Putin suggesting that the nuclear threshold, the threshold in which Russia might use nuclear weapons, could be amended. And it would be amended to ensure that if a non-nuclear actor, i.e. Ukraine, commits some sort of attack with the backing of a nuclear state, then that could be considered a nuclear threat to Russia. And so he's trying, to sort of get ahead of this victory meeting today and try and put the fear of God basically into Biden, who's already very sceptical about the use of these long-range weapons inside Russia, who already fears there could be escalation if he relaxes those rules, and to try and persuade him not to do so.
So this is a classic Putin scare tactic to go, look, if you allow Ukraine to, for example, use these Storm Shadow missiles to hit targets inside Russia, even though Ukraine is not a nuclear power, it's being supported by nuclear powers in Britain and France and the US.
Yeah, he's sort of muddying the waters. He's making people think again before they do something in which he could then use that situation to try and, to potentially launch a nuclear weapon. But I think we're probably going to hear the same things from military commentators today as they've said in the past, that he's likely bluffing, and he's used this technique during the whole of the war, really, trying to sort of increase the risk potentially of how the Western leaders would see it of using nuclear weapons, so the West isn't helping Ukraine fully in the way it could do.
It's interesting you use that word bluff. I mean, a lot of military analysts, as you say, look, repeatedly Putin's red lines have been shown to be a bluff, most recently with the incursion into Kursk. If Ukraine can physically invade Russian territory and Putin doesn't reach for nuclear weapons, that shows he is bluffing. And yet Joe Biden is still clearly quite cautious about doing anything that is seen to escalate the situation. Why is that? Why is the White House still so cautious?
Yeah, well, just on that Kursk point, I think if Zelensky had told the Americans and the British before he was going to do that, they would have been extremely, cautious and urge him not to do that. And obviously he didn't tell their sort of Ukraine's closest allies about that mission before it happened. And as you said, they did go into Kursk and they didn't get the reaction that perhaps some people would have feared from Putin, that would have been a red line for Putin, and yet nothing really, significant happened as a result. Obviously, Putin did then attack more Ukrainian towns and cities, but, nothing sort of hugely dramatic. And I think Zelensky will probably use that argument to Biden in the, Putin says he has all these red lines, but in reality, they're threats that are never going to materialise. And I think for Biden, he's only got a few more weeks left as president. He is very, very concerned about what his legacy is going to look like. And when it comes to the use of long-range weapons inside Russia, I think he's thinking, well, I don't want to escalate things just before I leave office to the point that then we end up in some war between the West and Russia. And he's just very nervous about doing anything dramatic before then, I think. So I think a decision on it will probably come when we see another president in the White House.
It's really interesting. Let's just focus on the Storm Shadow missiles themselves. We've spoken quite a lot about them on Frontline over recent months, but for those who aren't aware, what makes them a powerful weapon?
Well, Storm Shadow is really important for the Ukrainians because it's considered a long-range weapon that can hit targets more than 155 miles away. That's the official range. It's probably actually, in reality, much further than that. And then the French have got the same, they call it Scalp, and the Americans have got even longer range weapons. And the reason they're so important is because at the moment Ukraine can only hit targets a few dozen miles away, and they want to be able to hit targets deeper inside Russia, crucially things like ammunition depots, places where obviously any type of military equipment is being used, and also places where Russia is sort of got its logistics supply chain starting off. So anything that could be used to hit Ukrainian territory. And that's why Ukraine say it's so important, because Russia's able to launch all of these missiles, keep the supply chain going, because Ukraine can't actually hit those targets because they're having to be constrained by these rules imposed by the West.
And Ukraine has these missiles already. I mean, they've been using them in Crimea, for instance.
They have, and that's actually a point that people like Ben Wallace, the former Defence Secretary, makes. He says, well, they're already hitting Crimea, which Putin says is Russia. And so in Putin's view, surely we've already crossed that red line. What difference does it make if they start hitting Russian territory in mainland Russia? The problem with Storm Shadows, they've probably not actually got that many of them. However, the Ukrainians also want a lot of the German long-range missiles, which are Taurus missiles, and the Germans won't give them those missiles. And actually, if they did, there are potentially up to 600 of those missiles available, which could really help Ukraine on the battlefield. So that's just another whole topic of discussion, really, the Taurus missiles. The Americans have supplied them with these long-range missiles as well, and they've probably got a lot more of them than they have of the Storm Shadow.
Do you think if there was an announcement that Ukraine could use Storm Shadows and Scalps inside Russian territory, would that make it more likely the Germans would allow the use of Taurus missiles?
I don't think so. Actually, I was just asking someone today, one of my German contacts, and they don't think anything's changed recently. I think the Germans have sort of got their own rules and constraints around that, and I don't think us changing the rules around in which they can be used will change the German opinion. The Germans are worried that by supplying their Taurus missiles, they'd have to have German officers basically training the Ukrainians. They think that would have to be taking place on Ukrainian soil, and that's what the Germans aren't prepared to do. And so I think that is a red line for Germany at the moment.
And I suppose there's also the risk of, rising Ukraine scepticism in Germany with the rise of people like the AfD, which of course is something on sure to be considering. Just on the approval needed for these long-range missiles to be used by Ukraine inside Russia, if these are British and French missiles with the Storm Shadow and the Scalps, why are we waiting on Joe Biden's approval? Why does it need US approval?
I think there are two reasons, really. The first one we can't go into in immense detail because of the sensitive nature of it, but basically my contacts in the MOD say that they need American approval because the Americans need to help with the targeting of the process. And therefore, the Ukrainians believe that on a practical level, they need both Britain and America's backing in order for them to use Storm Shadow properly. I think the British government's also very nervous about going ahead with it without American support, because then they'll be on their own. And I think if anything escalates, they don't want to be sort of the sole country responsible for that.
And presumably that also explains why Zelensky hasn't so far been tempted to say, you know what, we've got these missiles already, we're going to use them in the same way as you described when he went into Kursk. As far as we're aware, he didn't get prior approval from his Western allies.
Yeah, no, exactly. And also I think there probably is a point that there's not that many Storm Shadow missiles left. So for it to actually have any dramatic impact on the battlefield, they need to get that approval from the Americans as well.
Do you think it would have a significant impact on the battlefield? Or is it just one of those things, and we've seen it time and again in this conflict, where certain issues take on symbolic significance? I mean, whether it's the battle for Bakhmut, which you could say wasn't necessarily strategically that significant, but it took on huge symbolic significance, and sometimes you have these debates over individual pieces of weaponry. Has Storm Shadow become one of those?
I think it has to some extent. I don't think it's going to be able to sort of shift what's going on in the battlefield in Ukraine's favour on its own. I think the point is that Ukraine needs help with lots of different things, and using these weapons to hit inside Russia will obviously help them.
Yeah.
I think probably more crucial is just the need for any weapons at all and ammunition. Also air defence systems. Actually, I asked one of my defence contacts in Ukraine just a few days ago basically what their shopping list was, and they're very concerned about air defence. They need more help with protecting Ukrainian villages and cities.
Is that top of the shopping list?
Yeah, they had a list of about 4. So it was that. They actually do need more long-range weapons just anyway, because they clearly are running out of them, and also 155mm rounds. And I think there were a couple of others, maybe drones as well. So, obviously they're mindful that these sort of weapon supplies aren't going to last forever. And actually, quite interestingly, we heard from Luke Pollard, the Defence Minister, earlier this week at the Labour conference, and he was basically saying that we've given them almost everything that we've got, and he was speaking in terms of all Western allies. Countries haven't got anything left to give, and now it's all about ramping up industrial production, helping Ukraine to develop things quicker and faster that they can take to the battlefield. But in terms of looking at what the MOD has got to give them, there isn't really anything in the cupboard.
Well, that is a really key point, and I know a lot of Ukraine's allies are frustrated that more work has not been done to ramp up industrial production, military industrial production, particularly in Europe. I mean, some would say this should have been happening 2 years ago.
Yeah, and that was one of the problems in the early days of the war. We sent things like NLAWs, those anti-tank missiles, to Ukraine, and we had loads of footage of those being used very successfully. But then we ran out of them, and we didn't even have any left for the MOD here. And then when the MOD tried to order some more, it was really difficult because basically they weren't being produced in the same way that they were previously. So this whole production line had to start again. And I think that's been the case with lots of things. A lot of these companies or products have been, the production of these things has been quite dormant. And then now everyone's saying, well, we've got to start developing these again. And it's just taking ages and ages. Whereas if you speak to Ukrainian defence companies, and actually I was speaking to one just last week. A couple of Ukrainian guys came over to London, and they were telling me that they were developing this amazing counter-drone technology in as little as 4 weeks, and they were going to the front line, speaking to Ukrainian soldiers on the front line, who were then saying, right, this is the problem right at this second. Then they were going back to the warehouse and developing something new that could then take on the Russian drones, which were adapting all of the time. And that is something that they need to be working on with Western allies more. But here in the UK, everything just takes ages. You're waiting years for something to be developed. And I think that's something that needs to be changed.
I want to come back to military industrial production in just a moment, but that's really interesting about the drones. I mean, we know now, the war in Ukraine is the largest drone war of all time. And as you say, there are innovations happening all the time. I mean, whenever the war comes to an end, will we look back on this and go, this was just a pivotal turning point in terms of drone warfare?
I think, the use of drones is just incredible. Actually, one of those Ukrainian guys was telling me that just within 1 square mile, they were seeing 800 drones in the skies. And one of the problems was that they'd have people that would have been, shot at by the drones. They're missing their arms and legs, and then they can't actually take them from the battlefield, because then there are so many drones still buzzing around the area. And so it's a major problem for the Ukrainians, and the Brits are obviously looking at this with real interest. And I think what we're going to see is through this, obviously we're having this defence review at the moment, I think there's going to be a large focus on drones, because clearly, you do still need conventional weapons, you do still need tanks, but actually cheap drones can have a dramatic impact.
Yeah. To go back to the issue of military supplies for Ukraine, are there other sources they are now looking at? I mean, obviously America's a massive provider of military aid, but South Korea, for instance, we look at how North Korea have been providing weaponry to Russia. Are there other potential allies who could be providing weaponry to Ukraine?
I'm not sure exactly about South Korea, but I know that what the Brits are doing, because they haven't got anything left really, they're trying to act as this sort of mediator and trying to get weapons from other countries and then getting those to the Ukrainians. So obviously there's a lot of that going on. There's probably a lot of countries, obviously, that aren't in Europe, as you say, that could provide weapons to Ukraine. And if the Brits are going to pay for it and then give it to Ukrainians, then it could work that way. So it's a way of getting around the fact that actually countries like the UK don't have huge weapons in supply.
Just to come on to the politics of it all, interesting that Joe Biden is thinking about his own legacy and he doesn't want to escalate the war in a way that may reflect badly on him, even though some would say actually the best legacy he could leave would be a victory for Ukraine. If it were a second Trump presidency, how is Kyiv viewing that currently? There was a lot of anxiety, maybe there still is, but are those fears overplayed? Are we assuming too much to suggest that if Trump wins, he'll immediately push for a peace settlement that would be unfavourable to Kyiv?
I don't think the fears are overplayed. I think you just have to look at what Donald Trump's been saying over the last few days on Ukraine, and if you're Ukrainian, you're going to be pretty terrified. Trump basically appears to blame Ukraine for the whole war and them not securing a deal early on. And Trump also seems to suggest that basically all of Ukraine's been destroyed and everyone's dead, and therefore they shouldn't be still getting billions of pounds of US money. And so I think if Trump does come in, then given what he's said so far, he isn't going to want to continue with whatever Biden's policy is at the time. He's going to want to rip it up and do something himself. He said that he is going to make sure that there's peace as soon as he gets in, that he's going to speak to Putin and Zelensky, and effectively in one phone call he's going to sort out the war. And so if you're Zelensky, you're going to be incredibly nervous about this, and which is why Zelensky is going to be putting a huge amount of pressure on Biden to do something dramatic before potentially Trump comes into the White House. I
mean, I'm inclined to agree with you. The reason I pose that question that way is because there are some people who say, look, when he was first president, there were fears he would withdraw from NATO and that never happened, and that sometimes his rhetoric gets ahead of him.
I think with the NATO question, though, he was able to sort of say, everyone needs to spend more, and everyone did sort of start spending more, and then he could claim that as a victory himself, couldn't he? I think on Ukraine, I don't know. I feel quite worried about the prospect of him getting in terms of what that looks like for the Ukrainians, because I think there is obviously going to be something that he's going to want to do in order to sort it out. And from the Ukrainian perspective, Trump thinks that the way to do that is to basically give the land to Putin, give some of the land that Putin's managed to take in the last few years and let him keep it. And that is not going to make Zelensky or the Ukrainian people very happy.
And were it to be Kamala Harris in the White House from January onwards, would that be continuity Biden administration in terms of their approach to Ukraine?
Yeah, we've not seen anything like completely different from Kamala Harris. I think she will essentially adopt the same strategy. I mean, maybe she might have a different opinion on the long-range weapons, who knows? But I think, potentially if she gets in, you could see more of the US trying to adopt Zelensky's victory plan and trying to do more to try and put an end to it, because of course she doesn't want it to drag on for years either. And I think there was a lot of appetite to try and see some sort of end to this. And Zelensky has said there can be an end, but I just need all the Western support that I can possibly get.
Let's just briefly touch on the UK government, because obviously there was a change of government earlier this year. It's now a Labour administration in charge. It appears from the outside, that there's not really a massive change in policy towards Ukraine. Is that true, or are there some nuanced shifts in position?
So in terms of policy like supplying more weapons and continuing with training of the Ukrainian armed forces, and for the policy on the long-range weapons, I think it's all stayed the same. So, for example, Ukraine can use all of the weapons inside Russia. That was the policy that was of the previous government. But then when you speak to people and sort of get into this in a bit more depth, I think there is a general feeling that this new government is more cautious. And so whereas you might have had the previous government maybe coming out a bit more publicly on the issue of the long-range weapons, this government really doesn't want to go on the record. They just want to avoid the issue altogether. And so I think that will start to have a bit of an impact. Instead of us being seen as this forward-leaning leader on Ukraine, I think we're much more likely to want to basically adopt whatever the US position is. And I think some people are a bit nervous about that.
And just finally, Larisa, is the biggest hurdle that Ukraine is coming up against currently this sense of sort of Ukraine fatigue, that the war has been going on for 2.5 years, that is costing a lot of money from its Western allies? Is that the issue? Whereas a couple of years ago, there was a huge groundswell of support for Ukraine, which is still felt by a lot of people, including, I know, our audience on Frontline. But in terms of the geopolitics of it, is it Ukraine fatigue that is the biggest issue for Zelensky currently?
I think that was a big issue. Then we had the Kursk operation. And I think that motivated Ukrainians because it was seen as, a great win. Really, it was a sort of temporary success. They've obviously taken a chunk of Russian territory. They've embarrassed Putin by doing so, and they've given Putin a dilemma by doing so as well. However, I think with the Kursk operation, obviously the idea of it was to pull away troops from the Donbass region, from the eastern Ukraine, and I don't think it's had the impact that the Ukrainians had hoped for. Instead, the Russians are really continuing to pulverize those places in the east. And so that's really stretched the Ukrainian forces, I think, more than they anticipated. And as a result, they have changed from sort of offensive positions when it comes to Kursk into more defensive operations. So they're trying to defend against Russian troops. And so I think, Zelensky's argument that sort of now is the time is quite a sensible one, because they have got that Russian territory right now, but in a few weeks or a few months they might not have that territory to trade in terms of a peace negotiation. And so I think that is what the fear is. I think the fear is that the situation could only get worse, and if they're going to force Putin onto the table and into a peace deal, then now is the time to do that.
Larisa Brown, Defence Editor of The Times, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.